Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Class Foundation. Thank you, Frank, for introducing us. I am a little bit nervous, so if I stutter, I do apologise. It's still early. I've only had one coffee. So this is the vision of University Cities of Tomorrow. And we have an amazing panel here, as you can see on the back. You can access all of the information about each of the speakers through swap cards. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more about who's speaking on the stage, you can also use our app. So we have, I'm going to introduce Martijn first. Martijn is from ISEF and is really driving mobility, student mobility across Europe. And it's the main reason why I think it's important to have somebody with his expertise and also representing such a great company that is basically helping shape the vision. I'm also going to introduce, hello there, Adam, who is from actually the US and flew in yesterday. He is passionate about planning, design, and urban development, so he's going to bring some of his expertise about satellite universities and how he expects universities to be shaped and change over the next few years. Perfect. We have Eri here, and I feel like Eri does not need to be introduced because I'm sure you all know who Eri is. Eri is from Collegiate, is passionate about student housing and is really driving the kind of really cool initiatives that are happening across student housing across Europe. I know you're also particularly interested in opening a business school as well. It's something that is a dream of yours, so we're really excited to hear about your vision as well. And finally, we have Barbara from the University of Parma. And, oh, that had a nice ring to it, didn't it? And also, Barbara is on the chair of sustainable universities across Europe. So I think it'd be really interesting to hear about how we can, as cities, become more sustainable and economically involved. And finally, myself, I'm Kellyanne Watson. I'm from the Class Foundation. I have worked tirelessly to put this programme together. And so I hope you enjoyed today. And I'm going to hand it over to Martijn. Thank you.
Thank you, Kellyanne. It's great to be here. It's fantastic to be here in an in-person event. People, place, person, I think, purpose. I think all these three are very valid here and now. And I think the title of the session, I think it's really ambitious. The vision of the university cities of tomorrow, and I have to disappoint you, I don't have the vision of the university cities of tomorrow, but I can contribute to that vision, as I think we all can. It's very important to, if we come to a joint vision for the university cities of tomorrow, it should be a joint effort involving all the stakeholders. So I think we have a great panel. We've got student accommodation, we've got urban planning, we've got the institutions, but it also involves destination marketing organizations. It involves local government. It involves the local population, students, international students, and indeed, I hope we can represent that here on this panel. Now, so a joint effort, a joint vision leads to a joint project, I think, and that's what this session probably kicks off for the class conference, and joint success. Now, the challenge is with any joint vision, someone needs to take that initiative. And the question here is, and I'd like to actually open up that question to the audience and to the panel, should the accommodation sector be the initiative taker? It's actually a poll, and I believe, Kellyanne, correct me if I'm wrong, that there is a poll that is going to be pulled up at the moment for our online participants?
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes. No, you guys can also vote as well. So in our Swapcard app, you can find it in the poll section. They'll be happening all day, so you can actually engage that way as well.
Great. So as the poll is being shown, I'll just read out what the poll is. The poll is, quotes as follows: PBSA providers play a leading role in the strategic agenda and future vision of their university cities. You can either fully agree, for example, strong involvement at the forefront and taking initiative are crucial keys to success. You can somewhat agree, it's not necessarily a leading role, but PBSA providers should be actively engaged in the strategic agenda and future vision. You can somewhat disagree. The strategic agenda and future vision are first and foremost the responsibility of the local city governments and the universities involved. Or you can fully disagree. The PBSA providers should just sit back and see what happens and follow up to respond to the demand that exists in accommodation. That's exactly. So before we hear any results from Kristen, I'd like to maybe start with the panel from the right to left. Eri, what would your answer have been had you had the beautiful app in front of you?
For me, it involves all the stakeholders. I think we've got challenges that we've experienced over a long period in places like the UK, where it's more mature, and challenges that are being faced over here in the rest of Europe, slightly different challenges in the States.
Sure.
But in the UK, you've got a lot of historic competition and potential tension with the shortage of housing. Some cities, like for example Oxford, where I used to teach for a while, and where I'm based, are unique cities with over 20% of the population is actually students, and those students crowd out local housing, and so the council works very closely with the university and allows only a certain number of students to go into homes. The rest, the majority, 80%, have to go into a purpose-built student accommodation. And that's been sort of worked on over the past sort of 15, 20 years to get to a stage. And it's still not perfect, but you require this collaboration to make sure that nobody crowds anybody else out and there's no local resentment.
It's interesting that you say that, though, because it's funny that we put students in a box, actually, and don't class them really as part of the societal makeup.
Right.
It's quite discriminative, if you think of it in that sense. But that shows how important it is for our role to be able to create a balance within society, because otherwise you would only have maybe students there for 10 months of the year, and you'd have 2 months where it's empty. But it's interesting that you say that.
Yeah, I think one of the issues is that historically we've always put everybody in one type of housing, whether it's a family or a worker or a student, and all the sectors of housing need to become more efficient, more specific, more, they need to have more amenities, they need to just not be, they need to be designed. We need to get better at doing it. And that's for everything, from old people down to universities.
It's interesting what you're saying there, indeed, because you started with a specific example that's, I guess, very specific to a number of cities. But then the last thing you mentioned is something that's relevant for all of us here, indeed. So the demand has really changed from students and international students alike. Bring it back to the poll. Adam, what would your answer have been? Should we take that leading role as an accommodation sector?
I think so. I mean, it's interesting. I think you have to look at this in the frame of COVID. And before COVID, at least in the United States, there was a real convergence between higher education and business. And no one was really sure how to do that. And then we had this 2-year hiatus where people got, a sense of what does it mean to not have students. And it's extraordinary to me the vitality the students brought. But I think the second thing is, because we were all working from home, many of the companies are like, wait a second, is there a solution that's embedded in all of this? And so I think then the next question is, who's on point? So at least in the United States, our governments are fairly weak. And if the government said, we're going to do an initiative for students, as you can imagine, most people would go, no, we're not. And then I think it's difficult for a lot of the universities. I think they're challenged financially, and they're just trying to figure out what's next. So I think the developer sector is extraordinary. And it's interesting, because I'm talking to a lot of our counterparts in the United States who are saying maybe we should be doing more of a lifelong product, kind of a graduated sort of step product. We've even got folks who are looking at retirees, and it's all really around alumni. So I think this kind of lifelong learning model is going to be really important, and it's going to be interesting to see. We don't use the phrase purpose-built student accommodation, which I only learned yesterday.
Okay,
so we call it student life. But it's interesting. I think that may end up being a much more important sector in our economy and may ultimately drive a lot of this.
Yeah, so that leading role, even if the government were to take that leading role, no one's going to accept it. I mean, that's different in Italy.
Yeah, in Italy we have a quite different situation. Because the main of the students' accommodation are held by the private sector. So for the first time, the recovery plan in Italy intends to give the opportunity to private sector, private entities and enterprise to act like as a leading role in building new students' accommodation. And that's a truly new things in Italy, because we don't really have a specific, for example, legislation for students' accommodation. And one of the main targets of the recovery plan in Italy is just to reform this sector. And we really hope to do well.
Great. Well, I think hoping to do well indeed will need us to take a lead. And I'd like to hear from Kristen if we have results coming in.
The results are in, people. And it looks like 60% of you somewhat agree. So not necessarily a leading role, but PBSA providers should be actively engaged in the strategic agenda and future vision. So that's first, and then at 30% fully agree.
Oh, so 90.
That's kind of what I expected.
Yeah,
right?
I agree. I agree.
And
We're a slightly biased sample.
So,
Yes,
right?
maybe.
Yeah. Well, that leading role, I think, is important when we talk about the EU recovery plan. And my first direct question to the panel members is then, what does the EU recovery plan mean to you in terms of investment and innovation opportunities? Now, it's an EU recovery plan. I'll start with Ari.
Rubbing it in.
Yeah.
Now that we're out of it. But I think part of that recovery plan is pretty ambitious, and some of the new initiatives, like, for example, wanting 50% of students in Europe to study in another European country are pretty amazing sort of projects. I think part of the opportunity that Europe has compared to more historic markets like the UK, where we are further down the line, is that you have the opportunity to learn from what we didn't do so well. You know, I think everything in Europe is likely to be more appropriate, more designed to higher quality, more fit for purpose than some of our historic stuff in the UK, where we have a lot of stuff that was really built just to put people in, rather than building communities. And one of the great opportunities we have is to build communities, build the right level of amenities in housing, for all types of housing, and then that helps improve the experience for students, improves the ratings for universities, improves the quality of an education. You know, and I think that's part of the opportunity, and it's exciting. And I think having the EU work actively to achieve this will be a fantastic catalyst.
What would you like to say to Adam?
Well, as an American,
yeah.
So so we're the people who left. You know, it's interesting. A lot of the work that my team does, we call it a talent shed. We look at an alumni base of a university. And two things really jump out at us. One of them is many of the premier American universities create enormous numbers of people who come back to the EU. So if you look at it, in certain cases, it could be 10, 5,000 people that are actually working abroad. At the same time, we're seeing American students, and particularly American parents, interested in having their children go to the schools here too. I have a number of friends whose school, kids have gone to the University of Amsterdam. So I think there's actually a kind of global conversation right now where you could be looking at students. I think Frank, who did our introduction, made some comment about these are global problems. And I think this idea that we all are in each other's places is really critical to that cultural understanding. So I would love to see, as odd as it sounds, the EU take a little segment of this and figure out if there's an outreach to people who are outside the EU who could actually come, because those people become ambassadors for the rest of their lives for the experience they had. And they take that to places where many people don't have that experience. And at least speaking for the US, we could really use that right now. So I think it's really important that we start to mix folks up. And so I think the program you've started, I'd love to see become a global program.
Yeah, wonderful. I fully agree. It is a global opportunity, global effort with global concerns, and we represent as ISIF the international students. So we represent the students that go from Nigeria to France, and from China to the UK, and from Latin America to the US, any other corridor you can think of. So there's all this mix of cultures, all this mix of needs, and you see a really rapid increase of the need for diversity in accommodation solutions. And it's good to respond to that and have that communication and conversation going between the different stakeholders, as I said earlier. How is that for you, Bert?
I'm basically totally agree with Harry, because in Italy we have a quite similar situation. I mean, we have so many historical university cities, and the main point for us is to basically triple the number of students' accommodation by 2026. And at the same time, we need to create a more convenient accommodation, energy-saving units, as well as fully connected accommodation. That's the main point. we really need to merge different needs. Address the needs of low-income students, abroad students, and many more. This is the main target we aim to focus on.
Absolutely. Well, Barbara, you actually mentioned there about some of the schemes and projects that you've got in place. I would love to hear about some city partnerships that you've been working on with some of these innovations and investments that you're looking at doing as well.
Yeah, I think you are referring to the project of the former prison we have in Parma.
Put people in the box.
I know it sounds strange. It sounds strange, but let me explain. The project we have in Parma is to revamp a former prison that it's dated back to 1832. It's a very huge building in the very city center of Parma, and it can be converted to basically 80 accommodation for foreign students and for low-income students. And the project is very, very exciting, and because we would like at one time provide good accommodation near the city center, near the main faculty buildings in Parma, and on the other hand, we would like to revamp an abandoned building, and this gives us the chance also to retrofit and also revamping a city neighbor, and that's a good point. I think not just for Parma, but for basically every historical city that needs to be more comfortable, more and address the needs of citizens and students. That's why I think it's a very challenging project.
I absolutely love that, and I've just gone ding, ding, ding. Maybe that's going to be a site tour for next year. Or at some point, I would love to come and see. And it's a really good initiative. So very, very exciting. Good luck to you. I'd like to kind of throw the same question to you, Eri. I know you do a lot of work with kind of city leaders, especially to help with kind of the planning process, but also to be able to develop products that the city are excited about as well. I'd love for you to be able to share some of those experiences.
I suppose this is my third decade in the sector, and I've learned a lot from making so many mistakes. I think sticking a little bit with, though we've done a lot of work across Europe, we pioneered initial new cities in the UK, but then we pioneered a new residence in Lisbon, first one. Then we did a lot of buildings in Spain. Now we're coming to Italy, and again, it's been learning through this journey. We have an in-house team of architects just to optimize buildings. But one of the interesting things that happened in Milan, where we've got I think it's the biggest student accommodation project in Italy, is we met with the deputy mayor and the whole team, and one of the things they were very keen on was not only us being there, because this project had been stuck in planning for 10 years, and they helped release it. They wanted us to be there, but they wanted to be able to have not just improve the provision of housing for university students, but for then those students to be able to stay in the city, or to go after they graduate, to be able to stay there. So our residences in Milan are geared up to house university students, but also graduates as they start to work, young professionals, because we have wonderful amenities, and after they graduate, they have to give them up. And why should they?
Right, exactly.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was similar to what you were saying, wasn't it, about thinking about the products being more long-term and keeping them there in the cities. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Adam, let's bring it to urban design. It's an important stakeholder in this whole process towards that vision. What are some of the challenges we face in urban planning and design currently within university cities that we need to address for our future vision?
Well, that's a great question. Let me do a little poll. How many of you use or are familiar with the phrase town gown? Does that...
Countdown?
Town gown.
Town gown?
We've got one.
Okay, we've got one.
Hi, Bill.
And you're American, so you're cheating, Bill.
Hi, Ian.
In the United States, there's a phrase called town gown, and it's really code for conflict. And until very recently, most universities had really adversarial relationships with the communities they were in. I teach at Georgetown in Washington, and you could do a documentary about the war. I hope this isn't public. The war between Georgetown and the community. And in the last 5 years, particularly with COVID, that has completely flipped. And suddenly the town is actually saying, how can you help? Because, we always saw you as adversarial. Your kids were, kind of messing up people's front yards. There's a lot of the I'm sure you're very familiar with. And now all of a sudden it's like, wait, this is why talent comes here. We get people here because they come to school here, and to your point, they want to stay. So I think communities are starting to change. And the challenge is that now that they pivot and say, well, you guys are great, who's on point? Again, I go back to that question. Who's the person or persons who can actually deliver the product that allows that to take place? And at least in my culture, real estate's extremely siloed. So you have people who build retail, you've got people who build mixed use, but in reality, that's retail with some housing on it. But when you actually talk about blended use and the dip in, dip out culture, we're creating who's on point. So I think we're seeing a lot of interest in who can build those building types. And I'm very interested here because I think you all are actually doing a lot of that. But I think going forward, there needs to be a planning armature where people say, I have a community, I have a certain number of assets, I have people that I'm employing, how do I put it together? And then I think in an entrepreneurial way, whoever's on point, and that could be multiple people, has to actually go out and tell that story. I work with a lot of entrepreneurs, and half of it is just establishing what's at stake, telling that story, and making the people they're pitching feel like they're involved in that. So that's a funny answer, but I think what's really missing is the sort of almost entrepreneurial framework to get the stakeholders to go, let's do this. And I think if we get that right, it'll really transform.
And that's what you call town gown?
Well, town gown right now is town plus gown. It
right,
used to be this sort of conflict, but I think now it's suddenly, and when you look at prosperity maps in the United States, anything that has prosperity, there's a university within 10 minutes of it. And if you look at places where there aren't universities, unless they have mining or some extraction industry, it's absolutely blank. So I think people are beginning to say, how do I get these resources distributed, and how do I engage them in the fabric of my everyday life?
I can definitely talk on behalf of the UK in that sense. Some
Yeah.
of the northern cities without a prosperous university as such, or as potentially maybe not doing as well.
Yeah.
And the Russell groups are dominating cities for students, but also wealth as well. So I can imagine it's similar across the continent.
Well, and I would imagine globally, if you did the similar mapping throughout Asia and Africa, you'd find the same pattern, which is education draws jobs, education draws prosperity. And I think there's a physical component to that, both the planning of the city and then the building types that anchor that city.
And education draws students.
Yeah, exactly.
So on that point, I think getting the university cities ready for the future, it's important as well to understand the rapid growth of the number of international students worldwide. I think we all know that no matter which crisis, the appetite and motivation of any student to study overseas is not going to be replaced by e-learning models, virtual reality platforms, or edtech. Students will always want to travel overseas. Actually, for every international student that studies overseas, 4 more would have wanted to study overseas. And we see that there's a move into that direction because thanks to the online delivery models, some of these students that wouldn't have that budget initially to study overseas may now choose to have a shorter time frame of study overseas, and then a part of that online. So hybrid models, blended learning, but lifelong learning, all these things, all these ingredients are super important to consider also when you're considering your accommodation projects, because they have needs for different time frames, different duration, different starting moments, different ending moments, if we can call it that, different types of accommodation. Also the newer generation of international students don't look at the same criteria to decide on their study destination. Of course, budget is very important, but university rankings are still important, but not as important as they used to be. They will look at, I think you mentioned earlier, they'll look at career opportunities.
Absolutely.
And with career opportunities, countries accommodate that with their visa rules, but the accommodation sector is not ready, because we have these beautiful buildings for students, but then they become a young professional.
Yes.
So there's a big gap there.
Yeah. It's interesting, actually, that you said about for every one student that comes and travels internationally, 4 would have liked to have come. There is initiatives in the recovery plan, not just to be able to renovate buildings, and there's money for new asset classes. There's also an initiative about student mobility as well, where they would like 50% of students to be able to experience studying abroad. And instead of giving money off on their course at the end, they're actually offering upfront lump sum cash. So this is hopefully going to open up opportunity for students that potentially may have not been able to afford that.
Yeah, and I think that's the result of the joint effort. There's a push going from the industry, and that is indeed where all the stakeholders come together. Can I ask the accommodation representative on this panel, how are you responding to these different needs and the diversity of students that are coming well, tomorrow?
I think it's something that's very important to recognize, that these guys need special places. You want to have rooms that are comfortable for them to, and the pandemic has actually highlighted this. So many people had to stay in their rooms for so long. We need to help to deliver better quality rooms with better amenities. I think one of the areas where we have a serious weakness still in Europe, even though we're learning, is the interaction with universities and municipalities, where we need to collaborate more, where, you know, either on specific projects or even on knowledge transfer. You know, it's funny, going back to Oxford, everybody welcomes BMW setting a new factory up in Oxford, but they don't realize the university produces far more value every year, which they resent. You know, but BMW would not ask for housing, but the university needs housing for its work. You know, there's a series of competing tensions and competing local priorities, but for universities and providers like us, we could do so much better if we collaborate, because universities, we found it in the UK, a small accommodation department without technical expertise is not going to know how to design a new residence.
Right.
Yeah.
They can use an expert architect, but again, they don't have enough experience of the student experience, of how they live, how they use their rooms. They don't have enough experience necessarily of the latest technology for how rooms should work, for what we've learned about what students want and like and how they want to live. And how they can feel comfortable coming from abroad, and making sure that they're going to feel sheltered in their rooms rather than isolated, and can enjoy the amenities.
When I listen to you speak and to the whole panel and get the feedback, and as I was preparing for this session, it's actually clear that the ingredients are there, the knowledge is there, the stakeholders are there, but still we're faced today already with an increasing discrepancy, difference between the demand and the offer. Barbara, where do you think it goes wrong? What major factor, maybe it's $1 million question, I don't know, should we look at to kind of use all that data, all these stakeholders, all the knowledge, to actually accommodate that future student?
It's a very, very difficult question.
That's why I'm asking you as a professor.
I have no proper answer. Let's say, I think one of the missing point is, as Ari said before, to make a stronger connection between city and university, because sometimes there are no proper relationship in developing students' accommodation, but also providing good mobility for students, especially for students that came from other countries. Let's say, talking about rent a bike, rent a car, and something like that, it could very profitable to make the most of the relationship between all these different actors inside the cities and university partners. I think this should be a lot developed in the next year. And from another point of view, and I'm talking as a professor now, we need more low-income students to come in our university and merge with other students, because these experiences, it's profitable not just for the abroad students, but also for our students, I mean the local ones. I think these are two main aspects should be developed more in the next few years.
That's great. I mean, we already have so many more international students coming to your cities. Your effort for lower income students, I think, can be applauded. But they also need accommodation.
Yeah.
How does that work?
we need to triple our students' accommodation firstly, and then provide comfortable, totally digitally connected units, because we hope not to have further lockdowns. But who knows? We have experienced some difficult times, but we have learned a lot about learning online. I totally prefer to have students in the classroom, but who knows? We have to provide all different appliances, devices in every student's unit. That's the basic need we have.
I'd like to touch on something Barbara just said then. I would really like to identify some of the barriers that we've got in place to be able to get these assets on the market. And I think it'd be really good to hear from a planning perspective, but also from a delivery perspective as well. Kind of, what are those barriers, and why does it take so long? And how do we join the dots really there?
Mm-hmm. Do you want me to take that?
Yeah, okay. That'd be great.
Well, you know, I think funny way it comes back to cost models and profit models. And so in higher education, at least in my world, it's a 4-year model. And it's an assumption of a set of experiences that comes bundled with, you know, residential and certain kinds of fees. And what we're seeing a lot of our clients looking at is actually moving toward what I'll call more of a subscription model. And that can apply to accommodation, it can apply to mobility. And I think that's the real challenge. Like when you talk about underserved populations, there are so many people who don't see a 4-year or a 2-year degree as part of their world, but they would love to have some kind of an educational resource. And I think what schools need to do and communities need to do is figure out how do we create a much more flexible framework. And the funny irony, because I was very involved in still remain very involved in the shared workplace, if you do it right, there's far more money. So ironically enough, broadening your market and applying to so many more people creates more profit. It's just the standard way of doing business isn't interested in, at least right now in the United States, the institutional investors look at it like, that's great, that's someone else's problem. I just want my money and I can go. So I think we need to kind of rethink not only kind of the structure of our society from a financial and educational point of view, but create kind of dual models where a school might very well have a segment of its population that continue doing 4- and 2-year degrees, but at the same time allowing for all these other folks. And those are the folks who ultimately create a much more diverse community. Those are the folks who are often survive. And I see this in Washington, I see it in Philadelphia, where I'm very involved, where if the institutions began to evolve their model, they'd have so much more impact. Everyone would have so much more, and frankly, candidly, there'd be more resources for everybody. So I think it's a software, not a hardware problem, but once the software gets solved, it'll drive different hardware, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a critical point. We've got a lot of tension across the world, particularly in developed nations, because trickle-down economics doesn't work.
At all.
Yeah. It can only work, the easiest way to make it work is through education. So if you drag people up and expose them, they're more likely to have access to the better jobs and start to do it. And so it's a fundamental problem that we need to address. One, affordability of housing, but probably before that as well, government policy. When I first went to university, I went several times, unfortunately, but we used to get grants, and we used to spend it all on hi-fis and parties and so on. But now everybody has a great big debt burden. And in the UK, at least, the debt burden is higher than it should be.
It is.
So we're crowding out those people who are more fearful of suffering economically. It's easier for the wealthy, and we want to somehow go back to a situation where we have this phrase from Tony Blair of equality of opportunity. And it started in the UK where they moved to 50% trying to be at further education. The EU's mirrored that as well with the Bologna initiative. They want over 30%, over 50% to experience higher education. And it's something important. But going specifically towards buildings and so on, there's only so much developers can do, builders can do, and operators can do to bring down costs. We can sometimes make schemes a bit more affordable with scale.
Scale, yeah, yeah.
But sometimes we need the municipality.
Yeah, they don't like it, do they? Yeah.
To maybe grant something like cheaper land that we can use under license and things like that. So I think a combination of those things will work.
Well, I hear affordability. I hear availability. The word I miss is accountability. I think who is accountable for, let's say, here in Holland? I think Groningen is a good example, or a bad example, depends how you look at it. There are students that have no room. There is an overflux in Amsterdam and in many other cities, I believe, of international students, and I'm sure the same applies to local students. Who is accountable? Is that the university who just keeps welcoming more students? Is that the accommodation sector that says, well, is that the local government?
Can I've got a personal opinion on this. I've got a personal opinion, and it's not the class's opinion. But universities are inviting students to study on campus at their university. They are having a financial benefit from this. They should be held accountable for it. They should be driving change within policy and legislation and working with the municipalities and also the private sector to be able to deliver houses for their students.
So that financial incentive is something that needs
Absolutely, but also again, it's about your talent, it's about reputation. It's
We had a similar situation in the US, in the UK, where many cities, but it's slightly linked to the way the admissions process works, which is not always in control. Universities don't always control that. There have been new cities like Exeter, the way it came up, others where suddenly they found themselves, Bristol as well, where they suddenly found themselves over-offering places because the places are conditional on results, their first and second choices, etc. So they have to guess.
Yeah.
Roughly where they're going to end up. Of course, universities are accountable, but they need to be supported by a system.
Yeah, well, we tried to actually look at that during COVID. We started working with EAIE, who Pete was on the stage this morning, actually working with the admissions office to actually look at where the admissions are and how they translate into enrolments, and then also updating on occupancy level within the private sector as well across Europe. And I think that's definitely a piece of work that we could, as a sector, work on.
I'd love to see that, yeah, great. Yeah.
I totally agree with Kellyanne. I think the university should be the main actors to promote new development of students' accommodation. But on the other hand, also municipalities can act as a proper engine to to do so, because if we have more students from abroad, also the city, I mean, retails, shops, restaurant can have a chance to better future. So.
I have a very simple example. I used to live in Tokyo, and in Tokyo you cannot get a car unless you have a parking spot. Shouldn't be the same for education institutions. You cannot enroll more students unless you can prove that there is accommodation.
Yeah, that's certainly a theory in the UK, and in Oxford you get punished for it. If they overshoot their numbers, they get punished by the municipality. Yeah. For example, they can have their planning limited, etc. So,
punishment.
Well, and I think most institutions would say, we're successful, you're punishing us for actually being good at what we do. Even though embedded in that is the lack of accountability for in fact, drawing that number of people there. But that's how they see it, I think.
Yeah. I like how we've passed all the blame.
Yeah, no, that's kind of true. Talking about the, I'd like to go back to that vision of the future university. What are some of the, like, say, common challenges that exist among different cities and countries? I think a lot of examples are very local. I think, Ari, you're involved in various projects across different places and cities. What are some of the common challenges that you think should be addressed in that future vision?
I think the biggest challenge, particularly we're experiencing in Europe with new projects, is that us as investors and developers get into a spreadsheet mentality, and everybody ends up trying to max out every project. You know, for also particularly because many of the projects being developed privately will be sold within a couple of years, and therefore all the stock might be at the high end. You know, and so you know, high quality should be something we should aim for, but it doesn't necessarily always have to be at the highest price, because that's not sustainable. You cannot have every new project be at that level. I mean, it's scary in Milan. We're going in with what we think will be the best quality project in the city, probably in Italy for a while, at least. Big rooms, high quality, ceramic floors, swimming pools, everything. But our rents are not crazy. They're 850, 900, whereas competing schemes are suddenly putting 400 extra a month onto their projects, and we can't see how that's going to be sustainable when there's 20 projects in the city. I think we have this common worry about developing too much of the wrong stuff or just one type of stuff, and it's not necessarily the wrong stuff; it's the wrong price point.
And that creates pressure. And I believe we're addressing that in a later session, but that brings me to mental health. I just mentioned that the next generation of students are looking at university rankings, but they're more looking at career opportunities, but they're looking at mental health, a big topic, discrimination, sustainability. I guess these are all topics that are coming back.
Yeah. Well, the next session is actually as well looking at Gen Z and actually who they are as a cohort, what they care about, what they're passionate about, what we're doing versus what they're thinking and also doing as well. So I think we definitely can touch upon that a little bit later in the sessions.
Yeah, great. A last question that I'm supposed to ask in this session is, we started this session talking about a joint effort, but how do we find and we've addressed a lot of issues, but actually it's the goal is to find the solutions and the right approach to align our sector with the universities and the cities, to align the agendas aimed at increased EU mobility, retention of talent, reaching environmental goals. So as we've been talking about challenges, what are some of the solutions that I can maybe get as a last round I see from each of the panelists? And maybe I start on my left.
I think that for Italy, as Harry said, the most challenging point is to provide affordable, the right number of student accommodation, but with a focus on environmental sustainability. I'm very passionate about this topic, so for me it's very important to provide not so many new buildings, but revamp older buildings. We need to focus on no land consuming, but on brownfield redevelopment. I know it's a quite side point of view, but I think we should focus on this point for future action.
I agree that we shouldn't be, there's great pressures on the world for sustainability. We need to start to address that, and we can as a sector, which is great. I think places like, for example, Milan at the moment has an energy efficiency bonus, so they will increase the amount of buildable area, occupiable area you can have if you have a more efficient building. I think that system of incentives would be great and could be expanded. Could be expanded to, for example, rather than saying you need a section that is affordable, you need to develop a scheme which has a continuum of product. And then you can arrive at a blended rent that's viable for the project and a continuum of offering that suits local residents.
I like that thinking. I believe, if I can add to that, we have done a lot of finger pointing in this session. It's the government, it's the institutions, it's the accommodation sector. I think maybe we can end the session on this note. It's a joint effort with any issue that we're dealing with. So we should look at ourselves. What can we as an international student mobility community do? What can you as urban planners do? That's the role we should take, but it's a joint effort, I would say, Kalyan, as a last remark.
I think one of the challenges, it goes back to planning. We think of planning as dividing land and then creating an opportunity to sell it. And I think what we need to do is look at outcomes related to climate and social outcomes and work our way back. And I think, people have issues and ideas and they have positions. And if they start with the position, they will always go where they go. I think we need to really say if this place in 20, 30 years is viable from a climate point of view, a social point of view, if it engages these future generations, what does it look like? And then you reverse engineer from that, what would each stakeholder need? But you always have to establish that outcome. Otherwise, they're going, I know what I know. It's back to the university basically saying, I'm doing really well, it's someone else's problem. I think as soon as you establish a common interest, it's everyone's problem.
Well, I hope you enjoyed our first session of the day. Thank you so much. And I hope you enjoy the food and everything else. And yeah, we're looking forward to chatting with us. Make sure you ask lots of awesome questions to these guys. We will have the collective agenda for change at the end. Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome job. Rocked it.